on those islands. Like they had to adapt and evolve on those islands because they were separated from their cousin species, their original species on the mainland. So it's that isolation that's actually going to cause the need for this evolution and for them to become adapted more to their environment. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to talk about isolation and how it starts the kind of the natural selection process, and then we're going to talk about different types of evolution associated with that. So what is isolation? So we're talking about natural selection occurring because members of one population become separated from one another. They only reproduce in those groups and in those environments, and because of this natural selection, because of the survival in those different environments, those needs, then that makes those two populations change over time because they're focused on their specific selection, their own survival. Okay, so you can see in our example here we have two different types of bugs, a couple different. They're all intermingled. They all reproduce together. That genes naturally appear of light and dark colored little beetles there. Let's say some type of isolation occurs, whether they're separated by a storm, or in this case separated by a stream forming in between them, and they can't get over. So whatever's on the left side is only going to stay on the left side, and whatever's on the right side is going to stay on the right side. Well, over time, since they're only reproducing in those populations, certain genes will start to pop up more often in certain populations than in others, for example. So you can see in this situation, on the top, we've got some darker colored beetles starting to appear more often, and on the bottom, the lighter colored, because for some reason or another, whether one side's shady, the top side's shady, and the other side is in sun most of the time, so they can hide from their predators in these situations. Whatever it is, these are the traits that are selected for. So over time, that's all that we see, and they only reproduce in those populations, so they've become isolated because they're not their own species. They can only reproduce within those small populations. So even if I remove that barrier now, let's say the water disappears, and now those populations can intermingle, they can't reproduce with one another. They are only reproducing with the beetles of their own kind, and that's how two different species could be formed. Okay, that's one type of isolation. Now this is known as geographic isolation because there's a physical land barrier in between the two species. But that's not the only type of isolation, although it's one that's pretty easy to understand. There's also reproductive. In other words, like the time of year or the time of the month or whatever it is that you happen to be reproducing regularly. If you have a group, like a good example are the frogs, if your group of frogs only reproduces in beginning of April, and another group only reproduces at the beginning of May, well, you will only keep reproducing with those frogs that are ready to reproduce at that time, so you will end up becoming two different species because you're only intermixing with the frogs of that type. And so over generations, you become more and more different, and you end up becoming your own species. So when you reproduce, the time for mating, that is a reproductive isolation. Mechanical isolation, that's when basically the parts don't meet or don't match anymore, so you physically cannot reproduce with someone that may be closely related, close, not necessarily an evolutionary cousin, but because the parts don't kind of meet up anymore, that's another type of isolation. Gametic, so this would be, you are two different species now, so your gametes don't fuse to create an organism anymore. And then the last one is behavioral isolation, and this is the idea that your species may have a mating ritual that you have to do in order to impress a mate or in order to get a mate at all, and those different behaviors guide who you can mate with, and then that would create two different species because, again, you're only mating with, in this case, the birds that do that mating dance or don't do that mating dance, okay? All right, so what does isolation lead to? So isolation leads to speciation, and that's the formation of a new species. This is the process by which species are created. Okay, we were all one. There was some type of isolation that occurred. We're now two different populations. As we go over time, we split more and more. We become more and more different, and eventually we can no longer reproduce within those two groups with each other, and now we're two different species. Okay, really good example of this would be lions and tigers, which we'll get into here in a second. So lions and tigers, they were once the same species. What ended up happening was they were competing with one another for the same, even though they were the same group, there was competition amongst packs, basically for the same food source. So what ended up happening was the lions stayed in the savanna, whereas tigers moved more towards the jungle, or at least their ancestors did. And since they were only reproducing with the big cats in the jungle, and they're only reproducing with the big cats in the savanna, and there are certain traits that make them better suited to those environments. For example, lions having the lighter color to blend in with the tall grasses, tigers having the stripes to blend in with the trees and the shadows and things like that. Okay, so those traits are selected for. Eventually, because they become separated for such a long period of time, they should no longer be able to reproduce. But what we find in lions and tigers is that they're actually still closely enough related that they can reproduce, but their offspring, a liger, that's if it's a male lion and a female tiger, or a tigon, if it's a male tiger and a female lion, if they have a child, okay, they can still technically reproduce, but that child is sterile, meaning that it cannot reproduce. So we still consider lions and tigers two different species because their offspring is not fertile. Now, if for some reason or another they weren't far enough apart and that liger that's created could still reproduce with lions, tigers, or ligers, then we would all consider them the same species and we would just consider them different breeds, almost like dogs, the same type of idea. Okay, so if a group of organisms are closely related and can produce offspring, then we call that a species. If you're closely related but you cannot produce offspring, then you're two different species. So that's the process of speciation. So what we will see over another 100 or so, or a couple hundred years, is that lions and tigers, if we keep them separated, will still continue. If they try to reproduce, won't even be able to produce a liger because they're going to continue to get more and more different over time, unless we intermingle their populations, and then they could end up coming back because of mutations. But that's neither here nor there. So that's speciation. So there's a couple of different types of evolution that we should know about based on the ideas of isolation and having traits that match your environment. The first one's divergent. Okay, so divergent, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the movie Divergent. Okay, it's the idea that you're becoming more dissimilar over time. Okay, another way to think about it is as you're taking your driving classes, you 16-year-old you. Okay, if I'm driving down the highway but I want to get off the highway, if I want to go a different direction, I'm going to diverge away from traffic. So I'm going to take the exit ramp. That's basically what's happened here. We'd had lions and tigers together. Tigers took off, took the exit ramp, went to the jungle. Lions continued on. Tigers went a different direction. Now they're two different species. They're diverging from each other. They were at the same point, and now they're splitting. So that's divergent evolution. So lions and tigers, again, had a common ancestor. They're now splitting into two different groups. They can technically still reproduce together and create that liger, but since the liger can't reproduce, then we consider them two different species. We see this in African and Indian elephants. Look very similar now. Over a couple hundred or thousands of years, they'll get more and more dissimilar. Chimps and humans, another good example. But anyways, this is what causes speciation. Convergent evolution is the opposite idea. It's the idea that I have two different species, two completely different species, but over time they start to look or act more and more similar. And the reason for that is because they occupy the same ecological niche, meaning they occupy the same place like in their food chain or in their environment. Okay, for example, sharks, especially think of like great white sharks, look very similar to dolphins. Okay, and they look very similar to a species of reptile that existed at the time of the dinosaurs, the ichthyosaur. Okay, that looked very similar to a shark and a dolphin. And the reason they all look so similar, same type of color, same type of fins, etc., is because those are the best traits for hunting in that environment. So that's why we keep seeing those traits popping up in predators in the ocean. Okay, because these are obviously the best traits to have. That sleek body design, that strong tail, that dorsal fin that helps keep them upright, stuff like that. So will they ever be the same species? Will they ever be able to reproduce? No, absolutely not. One here is a fish, the bottom one is a reptile, and the middle one is a mammal. Those are completely different organisms. But evolutionarily, they're converging and occupying the same niche and start to look more and more similar. So that's convergence. In other words, they're getting onto the highway in that case. Okay. And then lastly, coevolution. That's the idea that two species evolve in response to each other. Okay, a good example. Okay, rabbits are evolving because they get better camouflage. They blend in with their environment. So how does their species have to respond? Well, the hawks with better eyesight are the ones that survive. So all the hawk population gets better eyesight. So the rabbits have to get faster. So now the hawks have to get faster, et cetera, et cetera. So you're evolving in response to one another. You made this change, we make that change. Okay. Bees and flowers, another good example. Flowers only exist because of bees. They attract the bees. And likewise, the bees have that furry kind of stuff on them to carry pollen from one plant to another. Again, they're evolving in response to one another. And pretty much any predator-prey relationship is going to be a type of coevolution. Okay? Cheetahs, they have such a big, powerful tail. The reason is because gazelles, who they chase down, can kind of turn on a dime. And so the cheetahs that could turn as fast with them were the ones that survived, and what helps them make their sharp turns is by flinging that tail out in that direction, opposite direction they want to go, and helps keep them on balance when they make their turns. So cheetahs are evolving in response to gazelles. So they're evolving together, side by side. That's coevolution. So how fast does evolution occur? Well, there's a couple different theories about that. The first one's called gradualism. It's the idea that evolution occurs in slow, small steps over millions and millions or hundreds of thousands or whatever it is, years, okay? But we should see those small incremental changes in the species over time. Now, if we actually have those fossils, that's a different story. But that's the idea that slow, small changes. Punctuated equilibrium is kind of exactly what it sounds like when we say punctuated. So it's happening period. Okay? Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that major events are causing that change to occur quickly, whether it is a new predator moves in or whether there's a geographic change, whatever it may be, but evolution has to occur rapidly in order for that species to survive. So we may not see the small incremental changes in the species. Instead, we're going to see big jumps, okay, in order to get to our different species, in this case, a butterfly. So you can see kind of where we've gone. We have isolation. We talked about the different types leading to speciation, divergent, convergent, coevolution, and then the different types or speed of evolution. And then this gets us to the idea, the speciation gets us to the idea of gene flow and genetic drift. The reason your species stays a species is because you're able to pass genes amongst each other and keep variation, but yet keep each other similar enough that you can still reproduce. So how the species is maintained over time, that's called gene flow. It's the natural movement of alleles, those big T's, little t's, whatever, into and out of different populations of the same species. A good example would have been human beings. If we would have stayed, hundreds of thousands of years ago, separated on the different continents, Asia, North America, South America, Europe, Africa, whatever, you could obviously tell that there's lots of differences in those populations. If they would have stayed separated from one another, they could have become different species of human over time. But because the species continued to intermingle, populations immigrated and emigrated to one another, okay, then that allowed the natural flow of genes to keep taking place, and we're all able to stay connected. So that's why we have so many differences in our population, but we can all still reproduce together. We're all still the same species. It's because of gene flow. And then genetic drift is just the idea of different traits moving into or out of a population. Without these processes, isolation occurs. So you can look at the little chart here, the picture. We've got our green bugs and our tan bugs, which are technically the same species. If that little tan bug didn't go and spread its genes to that other population that kind of keeps it connected, then those would become two different species. And then this is related to an idea called the bottleneck effect. And the bottleneck effect is when gene flow and genetic drift are interrupted because of usually some type of natural disaster. So in other words, we had a population very set in stone for over thousands of years. For example, we're going to use these little smiley face creatures. We usually have lots of yellow faces. We'll have a couple of blue and just one green. Okay, so again, we're talking about the bottleneck effect here. And no matter what, generation after generation, we kept seeing the same genes over and over and the same amount of them. But then all of a sudden, there's a natural disaster. Oh my gosh, okay? Everyone's got to run and hide. There's chaos. People start dying off, whatever it is. There's epic failures all over, just like this one. But eventually, when it's all said and done, this is what our population looks like. We have more blue faces than yellow faces, and the green faces are completely gone. So what will my population look like pretty much from here on out? Well, if we follow the idea of gene flow and genetic drift, we should see the same population occur regardless throughout the generations. We're going to see more blue faces now than yellow faces, even though before the natural disaster, it was the opposite. But it's because now there's more blue genes than there are, that's funny, yellow genes, okay? So that's the idea of the bottleneck effect. We were all in one population. The population shrank dramatically because of a disaster. And then as the population grows again, it's all based on that original founding population, whatever we started with. So that's the idea, like picture a bottle. That's exactly what we do. We were wide and then we got really narrow at the top. The founder effect is basically the same idea, but it's just the idea that a group becomes separated and they are going to found the new population. So in this case, we had red bugs and green bugs. Some red bugs get stranded or go move off on their own. So in that population, we will only see red bugs. Okay? But that has to do, again, with the different types of isolation, which you can see here on the left side of the screen, and that also has to do with gene